In researching this DVD commentary, I read a lot of the books about Bruce Lee, and they all had the same 3 or 4 sentences about the film. So let's try to give it a bit more depth. Here we are at the titles, so I guess now's the time we should talk about the title of the film. In Cantonese, the film's called Tong Sang Dai Hing, and the Tong of Tong Sang Dai Hing refers to the Tong dynasty, an ancient Chinese dynasty. And San means mountain, so you have Tong Mountain. And this really refers to China. And the Tong era, the Tong dynasty, was the first time that Chinese people really went out and traveled into the rest of the world. So Tong Sang Dai Hing is big brother. So the literal meaning is big brother from China. So the Chinese title of the film actually refers to the Bruce Lee character, who is the big brother who comes from China, rescues his relatives in Thailand. Whereas in the international version, the big boss, is the title actually refers to a bad guy, Han Yan-git's character. So there's an opposite there. And of course in America, the movie is known as Fists of Fury. And the reason for that is quite simple. The label of the film actually got swapped by accident during it being shipped from Hong Kong to America. So this movie was meant to be called The Chinese Connection because it has a drugs theme to it. And so The French Connection was made the same year that this film was made. So it was like a play on the connection idea. And the labels were swapped. So this became Fists of Fury, and the film that's known in Hong Kong and elsewhere as Fist of Fury became The Chinese Connection. And there's the way strange things happen in the world of East-West filmmaking. The original translation of the Chinese title, when the film went into production, was King of Boxers. And, of course, now it's better known far and wide as The Big Boss. And here we are with the first scene of Bruce Lee's character arriving in Thailand. And this was shot in Pak Chong, which is actually was a small town north of Bangkok. And this, of course, is the first time that Asian audiences or Chinese audiences had seen the adult Bruce Lee as an action star. I mean, he had been a successful child actor, had gone to the States, had done a certain amount of work in Hollywood. He never became a big star. And then suddenly here he is back on the scene and being launched in an action vehicle. So it was, I think probably it's hard for us now to imagine the impact Bruce Lee had because he really came out of nowhere as far as the Asian audience were concerned. Whereas now, of course, he's firmly established as this cross-cultural icon and a hero to millions of people around the world. Setting up one of the plot points here that Bruce Lee's character in the film, Cheng Chao-an, has made a promise to his mother that he won't engage in fighting under any circumstances. And you see the old man here, his uncle, he brings out the jade that Bruce has around his neck. Jade is a symbol of filial piety, particularly referring to mother. And I mean, the respect of children for parents is a very key element of traditional Chinese society. So that's one of the plot points. There originally was a backstory that doesn't really make it into the script here, that Cheng Chao-an's father had been a martial arts expert and had been killed during a challenge match. And so the mother, not wanting to lose her son, had made him promise never to engage in fighting, never to put his life in danger. Again, a very, very key element in Chinese tradition is that the family name should continue. So a son's responsibility would be to marry and have children so that he could continue the family line. Here's the first scene of James Chen Jun, who was a popular martial arts actor in this era. And interesting to note that he was on hand in case things didn't work out with Bruce Lee, because nobody really knew if Bruce Lee could carry a film as a martial arts action actor. I know that sounds ridiculous today, but that's what I've been told, that when they were preparing to do the film, because no one had really seen Bruce Lee do anything in terms of starring in a full-length movie, they had James Chen on hand, and if Bruce, for whatever reason, hadn't been able to carry the film, then they would have boosted James Chen's role, and he would have been more of a co-starring or even a starring role for James Chen. Of course, they soon realized that you didn't need too much of James Chen in a Bruce Lee movie, so he just really gets to show his stuff in the first section of the movie. And the fight scene sequence here is in the traditional 70s swingy arm style, in which you kind of swing your arms and legs at somebody until somebody falls down. And it's interesting to note in this movie how the movement of Bruce Lee himself is different from that of the other people fighting in the film. And not only that, but the way that the fights are shot. are different when Bruce Lee is in front of the camera and in action. And now moving to the next plot point, which is that Chang Chao-an has come to join this family. These aren't actually blood relatives, but they're a group of Chinese who are making a living in Thailand. And it's interesting when you look at the film to see how little there is to show that this is Thailand. It really could be almost the new territories in Hong Kong, because the setting itself is really nondescript, and it's a general backdrop against which this action unfolds. The last man introduced us there is Lee Kun, who is a popular comic actor, and he had an interesting time on this movie because one day this pretty Thai lady comes on the set and said she wanted the autograph of Mr. Lee, and he thought she meant Bruce Lee. And when Bruce Lee came out, she's like, no, not him. We want the other Lee. And Lee Kun comes out, and she says, yeah, you're the guy I want the autograph from. And they subsequently married and remain married to this day. So he actually met his wife on the set of The Big Boss. And Bruce Lee turned to him and he was like, oh, is your name Lee as well? I think they obviously hadn't been formally introduced at this time. So that was a kind of a happy byproduct for Lee Kun about starring in The Big Boss. There's our leading lady, Maria Yi, whose Chinese name is Yi. Her real name was Wai Lin Ai, and she's actually from Shanghai, as was the director of the film, Lo Wei. And she and another actress we saw earlier as the cold drink seller, Nora Miao, played swap roles in this movie and in the next Bruce Lee film, Fist of Fury. In the Big Boss, the leading lady is Maria Yi, and you see Nora Miao in a walk-on role. And in Fist of Fury, it's Nora Miao who's the lead, and Maria has a walk-on. So they were like introduced round about the same time as potential leading ladies. But Maria Yi really only went on to be in a few more films in Hong Kong. She starred in a movie called A Man Called Tiger, which was meant to be the third collaboration between Bruce Lee and Lo Wei. And in fact, Bruce Lee decided to direct his own film, Way of the Dragon. And instead, Wong Yu took over the film, which was shot in Tokyo. And Maria Yi was the co-star. And after that, she apparently met a wealthy gentleman and married and left the industry, which at the time was pretty par for the course in the Hong Kong film world. Here we are at the Ice House, and now whenever I look at this, I remember in the movie Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, how the ice house that they had there, which was actually constructed up in the new territories of Hong Kong, was the setting for this big kung fu showdown between Bruce Lee and a challenger. And I doubt that anything close to that happened in reality, but certainly it was the same setting. In terms of challenges, people have often asked, when Bruce Lee was in Thailand, did he have any matches with Thai boxers, or did he fight any Thai boxing experts? The nearest I've come to hearing any such story was that they had a coach who was an experienced Thai fighter, who was training the Thai extras how to perform in the fight scenes. And some of the stuntmen said, oh, why don't you try out Bruce Lee? And this gentleman agreed, and they just squared off, and Bruce Lee just did one kick, and it was so powerful. After that, the Thai coach had a lot of respect for Bruce, and that was as far as any challenges went. But there are obviously no classical Thai boxers in the film, and one of the reasons for that, my understanding is that there are actually some Thai boxing schools in the area, and certainly many in Bangkok, where some of the film was shot. But the Thai boxing instructors, once they heard that their fighters would have to be knocked down on camera by the Chinese hero, declined to participate. So I think it's quite obvious when we see the Thai henchmen that they're just guys who are primarily extras who've been taught by their own trainer and by some of the Hong Kong stuntmen how to take a punch, how to take a kick. So there are no classically trained Thai fighters in the movie. And as we were talking about earlier, this is actually the first Bruce Lee movie as in terms of a film in which he was the star of the film. And various people have claimed that they discovered Bruce Lee subsequent to his leaving Hong Kong for America. Producer Si-yun was working at Shaw Brothers and apparently had seen the TV series The Green Hornet, or he'd heard that Bruce Lee was a name to look out for. He couldn't get anybody interested in backing him. Another gentleman called Victor Lim has told me the same story. Unicorn Chan, Siu Gelan, who was a childhood friend of Bruce Lee's and would star in several of Bruce Lee's later films, approached Shaw Brothers to try to get a contract for Bruce Lee, and the best they could come up with was the standard actors contract that Shaw Brothers offered new actors at that time. And obviously that wasn't good enough for Bruce Lee. And again, with hindsight, it's easy to say, well, why didn't they immediately sign him up for a multi-million-dollar deal? He was obviously going to be a huge star. But in reality, Bruce Lee, as an action star, at the time The Big Boss was going to be made, was an unknown quantity. He'd been in a bunch of movies as a kid, and it would be like Macaulay Culkin coming back to Hollywood and saying, you know what, I want to be in Rambo Part 4. People would say, gee, I remember you were a cute kid, but can you carry an action film? And I think this was the attitude people had towards Bruce. I mean, it was known that he'd gone to America. He hadn't really been hugely successful there. I mean, his biggest credit was The Green Hornet, which had not been a successful show. It had just run for one season. And even Bruce himself would have admitted that he hadn't achieved as yet the things he wanted to do in Hollywood, and had an opportunity to go to Hong Kong and pursue his career there. And that's why he was coming back. But people apart from Raymond Chow, who was, I guess, the one guy who really had the clarity of vision to see Bruce Lee's potential, the other producers in Hong Kong were not as confident. And the story of how Bruce came to be discovered by Raymond Chow was, again, there are several versions. I heard one from the son of Lo Wei, David Lo, who claims he saw Bruce Lee demonstrating on TV and then mentioned this to his father, and his father mentioned it to Raymond Chow, and then Raymond sent the wife of director Lo Wei, Lao Lenghua, sent her to fly to Los Angeles to sign Bruce Lee, or else another woman, a woman called Cheng Poi Poi, who was a swordplay actress who had also retired to L.A. And Golden Harvest really needed a new big star. So this woman was sent to L.A. to come back with a contract with either the name of Bruce Lee or the name of Cheng Poi Poi on it. And in the end, she came back with both. So she must have been a pretty good negotiator. And I remember talking to Cheng Poi Poi, and she told me that when Lao Lenghua was in L.A., she stayed at the home of Cheng Poi Poi and her husband, who was a businessman, and that Bruce Lee used to come to the house to negotiate the deal for The Big Boss and Fist of Fury. And her husband was a rather, traditional Chinese businessman, and he used to see Bruce coming in with his open collar and his long hair and smelling of incense, and he used to say, oh, here comes that hippie again. Which I think now when we think about Bruce Lee, it's hard to imagine anybody looking at him or perceiving him in that way. But I think it's interesting to try to see Bruce in the milieu of his time and during that era of Hong Kong film and of society, rather than losing track of the fact that he was somebody who grew up in a very different time and a very different environment to our own. And it's interesting to see the challenges he had to overcome. There you saw one of the traditional bits of hokery of Hong Kong filmmaking, the trampoline jump. This was actually pioneered in Hong Kong film by Hon Yan-git, who plays the bad guy in Big Boss, who had actually been a veteran stuntman and martial arts coordinator. And he was the first one, when he worked at the Shaw Brothers studio, he was one of the first guys to come in and kind of simulate weightlessness with the use of a trampoline. Later, wires would be used, but at this stage, the trampoline was one of the main aids for flying effects in Hong Kong films. This film comes at a period when in Hong Kong movies there was a transition from swordplay films to empty-handed combat. And the film was really the reason that Golden Harvest were willing to invest in a hand-to-hand combat, a martial arts picture, was really that Jimmy Wang Yu's film, The Chinese Boxer, had been a big hit for Shaw Brothers the previous year. So it was felt that if you could do a similar film, maybe on less of a budget, because Wang Yu was a big star at the time, and James Tien was not as big, and Bruce Lee was kind of an unknown. But if you could make a similar kind of film shooting in Thailand where it was cheaper, you'd probably make some of the same kind of money back. Obviously, they far exceeded that when the film was finally released. At the time, in 1971, the kind of films people were making were New One-Armed Swordsman, The Invincible Eight, which was like a swordplay film that was also directed by Lo Wei, The Angry River, which was the first Golden Harvest film, and the only movie made in that year that really was in its own way as groundbreaking as The Big Boss was A Touch of Zen, which was a movie directed by King Hu, on which Sammo Hung and Jackie Chan were toiling as stuntmen. This creek, strangely enough, of all the locations in The Big Boss, is exactly the same now as it was when the film was shot. One of the fans of the movie actually made the journey to Pakchong to try to find the locations where the film was made, and the ice house wasn't there anymore, and the dock was all changed, but this creek was exactly as it is in the film. So if you go to Thailand and you make it to Pakchong, you look out for the creek. And we see here the son of the main villain, played by Lau Wing. Lau Wing, second-generation actor in Hong Kong film circle, and this was his debut film as it was Bruce's. He was a karate exponent and was discovered by Lo Wei, who cast him against type. I mean, he's a good-looking, striking figure, but he's cast here as a very slippery, very evil character, so he was cast against type. And this little moment of contact here for Western audiences is really very tame, but for Hong Kong audiences, it's really, at that time, an unmarried couple, a young guy and a young girl, would not, under normal circumstances, embrace or touch each other. So it had a different air to it in 1971 than it does now. And here we are back at the ice house. Pak Chong, by all accounts, was a pretty miserable place to make a film. And when they shot the scenes in Pak Chong first, and then later moved to Bangkok to shoot the other scenes for the film. And when they were shooting in Pak Chong, Bruce Lee was washing up a glass, and it broke in the sink and cut his finger. And so he obviously had to bandage it. No explanation of this is made in the film. He just has a bandaged finger for almost all of the movie. But when he's in Pak Chong, the bandage is bigger because the injury was more recent. And then by the time they moved to Bangkok, the finger had almost healed. So he's got a smaller and smaller Band-Aid or bandage on the finger. So if you have watched the film many, many times, as I have, it might be fun one time to just go through the film and spot scene by scene the continuity shift in terms of the bandage on Bruce Lee's right hand. Bruce Lee arrived in Thailand on July 23rd, 1970, to shoot The Big Boss. And at that time, the director was a gentleman called Ga-sung, who was an old-time actor in the black and white Chinese films. And he'd become a director. And according to all the published reports, he was very ill-tempered and he didn't run a very happy set. So as this film had taken on a new level of importance, now Bruce Lee had been cast, they decided that he would be replaced. So after a couple of weeks, Ga-sung flew back to Hong Kong, and Lo Wei came on board. And Lo Wei was somebody very experienced in almost every aspect of the film industry. He's from Jiangsu province in China, and he began his career actually as an actor, working under the name Luo Jing. And his most famous and his best performance perhaps is in a 1948 film, Sorrows of the Forbidden City. And he became a director, and in 1958 directed a big hit movie, Jade Green Lake, which starred his wife-to-be, who we talked about a few moments ago, Lau Langhua, who was the person that signed Bruce Lee to be in the film. And this film, the reason it was successful is that it had romantic scenes with kissing and hugging and stuff that by today's standards are very tame, but by the standards of the day it was the equivalent of maybe what the impact that Basic Instinct had when that film came out in the States. So Lo had been working at Shaw Brothers, and he left Shaw Brothers shortly after Raymond Chow left Shaw Brothers. Raymond Chow formed Golden Harvest, and Lo Wei was one of the first directors signed by that company. And he actually shot the very first Golden Harvest film, which was The Invincible Eight. There was another movie by Wong Fung called The Angry River, which was shot subsequently but released first. So the very, very first Golden Harvest movie was directed by Lo Wei. And it also starred James Tien and Nora Mao, two of the stars of The Big Boss, who are also, who were at that time Golden Harvest contract players. And he used to work with the same actors, film in, film out. He eventually left Golden Harvest and formed his own film company, and they had a hit with Lei Kun in the film Shantung Man in Hong Kong, which is like a comedy, an even more outrageous comedy version of a Bruce Lee movie with a country bumpkin coming to the big city and making a name for himself. So let's just talk for a moment about the language of the film, because there are many articles about Bruce Lee's films in Hong Kong where they're referred to as Mandarin movies, which might seem strange because the language that Bruce Lee spoke, the dialect of Chinese that Bruce Lee spoke, was Cantonese, and that is the dialect of Hong Kong. But at that time, Mandarin was the language of the cinema. And there were two reasons for this. For some reason, there was a sense that Cantonese was a street language and Mandarin was the language of more educated people. And also because these films didn't only play in Hong Kong, they played elsewhere in the region where Mandarin was a more common dialect. So for that reason, the films originally were shot just wild. There was no sound recorded on the set. And then later they'd be dubbed into whatever dialect or whatever language was required. And the primary language for the Asian market was Mandarin. So Bruce Lee's, the audiences never got to hear Bruce Lee's own voice. And in fact, his voice was dubbed for Big Boss, Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon by the late Cheng Pui-san, who was an actor in his own right. And it was felt that his voice in Mandarin was a good match for Bruce Lee's voice when he was speaking Cantonese. And so there was not an official, there was no Cantonese version of the film until many years later when the video boom happened and the Bruce Lee movies were released in Hong Kong, by which time the audience had become accustomed to watching Cantonese language films. Cantonese had come back into favor, and so there had to be a Cantonese version. So the film was redubbed. And whereas in the original film, we don't even hear the battle cries, the watas of Bruce Lee, when they redid the dubbing, they actually lifted the Bruce Lee war cries from the other movies and dubbed them into the Big Boss. So you had like a soundtrack featuring elements from different sources. And the other language that the film was dubbed into very soon after it was finished was English. And the original dubbing session in Hong Kong was produced at breakneck speed and was it's a pretty typical slipshod Hong Kong 1970s Hong Kong dubbing session with all the the boss is gone and all those kind of strange voices. And when they were preparing the film to be released in the States, the Roy Macquarie, who was handling the overseas sales on the picture, said, well, this dubbing has to change. And so they redubbed the movie and released it. And of course it was a big hit. And by that time, the whole Kung Fu boom was up and running. So they didn't bother to redub the subsequent films. They were just released with the Hong Kong dubbing in place. And it was a great source of pleasure to longtime fans like myself is the bad dubbing in and of itself is kind of fun. So it adds to our enjoyment when we watch those films. But I guess it's an acquired taste. This is probably one of the grimmest scenes in a film of this era. And Mandarin cinema could be pretty bloody, but normally it was more fantasy violence with swordplay, and this is rather realistic, and the lighting is very, very grim, very noir. I think Lo Wei, as a director, we can never say he was a great director, but he could create atmosphere very well. He was a very good Gothic director. He directed a movie called The Comet Strikes, which is kind of like a Hammer film, a displaced Hammer film. And it's very dark and mysterious, and the shots here are very well put together. And I think he's somebody who, had he focused on thrillers, dark thrillers and horror movies, probably would have made better movies. But he really wasn't somebody who I ever felt had a great affinity for martial arts action. There always was a sense that he was just rushing through the martial arts in the other movies that he made. And there was dispute between him and Bruce as to who was responsible for the success of the films they did together, The Big Boss and Fist of Fury. And really it's there's not much of a case to answer, because you just have to look at the other films that Bruce Lee made, which are worldwide respected classics of the genre, and the films that Lo Wei made, which by and large haven't stood the test of time. So I think it's evident that Bruce Lee really brought a lot to the productions that he worked on. This gentleman is interesting. He's a main character in the movie, but before the end of the film, he actually disappears. The foreman is actually the guy who orders the death and actually supervises the death of two of Bruce Lee's relatives. But before the end of the movie, he kind of vanishes from the scene, and no one knows why. I don't know why. Maybe he was a contract player and he had to work somewhere else, or maybe he just disappeared one day. But he's somebody who, in terms of the story structure, kind of deserves his comeuppance. And he never gets it. He just vanishes from the scene. And Something that's come up in recent years is I've read a lot of articles of people talking, was Bruce Lee a real fighter? And he's compared with the karate champions of his day, people like Chuck Norris and Bob Wall and Joe Louis, all of whom were fine athletes, and within the restrictions of the rule systems they fought under, they were very good martial artists. But the implication's always been, oh, so-and-so was a real fighter because he was in karate tournaments, and Bruce Lee was not, because he only trained his students and he only made movies. And to me, the thing that really makes me think that Bruce Lee was a real fighter is the fact that the stuntmen had respect for him. Because Hong Kong stuntmen are really a tough breed that in the 70s particularly, when they were growing up on the streets of Hong Kong, there were people who were like full-time stuntmen and part-time gangsters and vice versa. And there were guys working on the Bruce Lee movies who had real fights, not tournament fights, but they'd had real, life and death encounters on the streets, maybe with bricks and boards and knives and who knows what, and had lived to tell of it. So there's just no way that they would have given respect to a paper tiger. So the fact the stuntmen, to this day, the surviving stuntmen who worked on The Big Boss, still talk about what a great fighter, what a strong man Bruce Lee was, that he was a real martial arts master. The fact they still say that, when there's no reason, they're not getting paid to, there's no reason for them to do that. That really impresses me a lot more than the reactions or the kind of the statements made by some of the martial arts community in America after Bruce Lee had passed away, when they all came out, or some people came out and said, oh, he wasn't that good, or I was better, or so-and-so was better. They obviously they really want to push up their own ego and their own reputation at the expense of somebody who's sadly no longer with us. Whereas I think the Hong Kong stuntmen are very honest. They called it as they saw it. And we just saw the first scene with Han Yan-git build his Han Ying-chieh, which is the Mandarin pronunciation of his name. And he's, as well as playing the bad guy, the big boss of the movie, is also, on paper, the film's fight choreographer. But I think it's quite evident from the two different styles of action in the film that those scenes where Bruce Lee is fighting were choreographed by Bruce Lee, and those scenes where other people are fighting were the ones that Han Yan-git directed. But giving respect to elders is a very, very key element of Chinese culture. And so during the production of the film, there was no question of Bruce Lee pushing Han Yan-git aside and saying, okay, I'm going to be the action director. So Han Yan-git retained his credit, even though Bruce Lee evidently made significant contributions to the choreography of the film. And Han Yan-git, somebody with a very interesting life. There couldn't be two people who look less like than him and Jackie Chan. But actually, their life stories are very similar. Like Jackie, Han Yan-git his family's from the Shantung area of China, and he was born there in 1927. Like Jackie Chan, he joined a Peking opera school, though his school was actually located in Beijing, and Han Yan-git started training at the age of 3. And then in 1946 moved to Shanghai and entered the film industry there as a stuntman. Subsequently, he moved to Hong Kong, and he specialized in northern kung fu, which has got a lot of flashy jumping kicks and flips and these kind of movements. So it really lent itself very well to doing stunts in films. And so he soon found work at the Shaw Brothers studio, working as doubling some of the big stars of the day. He doubled Lin Dai, who was a big matinee idol in that era in the early 60s. And strangely enough, at that time, the Cantonese films were popular, and they were shooting sync-sound Cantonese language films in Hong Kong. But Han Yan-git, having been raised in Beijing, didn't speak Cantonese or didn't speak Cantonese very well. So he could rarely be given speaking parts in the films. So he was a stuntman or else just came on as a martial arts fighter. And then later, when the swing went back towards Mandarin, they stopped shooting sync sound, so it didn't matter whether or not he was speaking Cantonese or Mandarin. So he was then later dubbed by another actor into Mandarin. And the swing back and forth between Cantonese and Mandarin is one of the oddities of Hong Kong cinema. He was a strong character actor in his own right and a mainstay of the films that were produced. He died a few years ago. He was a mainstay of a lot of the Golden Harvest martial arts pictures of this period. He was actually the action director on an early version of Pham Mot Lan, which was the Legend of Mulan, was remade recently by Disney. And there was a 1964 version of the film about the girl going off to join the army in place of her father. And he was the action director for that. That was shot in 1964. And he was often worked with King Hu, somebody I mentioned earlier, who directed, and he appeared in A Touch of Zen, which was the film that King Hu shot the same year that Big Boss was made. And was also Han Yang-ge also worked on the very first released Golden Harvest film, The Angry River. So the Big Boss in the West, the Big Boss is the title of the film and the name of his character. So I suppose in a sense Han Yang-ge could be perceived as being the star of the movie. And now we get an example of his style of choreography, and it's very indicative of like 1970s slam bang martial arts action, the Hong Kong style of martial arts action choreography. And not just the movements themselves are a kick is a kick and a punch is a punch. But what makes the Bruce Lee action different is the way the camera moves, the way the editing is actually, when he's shooting the film, he's obviously thinking about editing. And Bruce Lee had a very strong camera sense and a sense of how to edit film to increase the impact of the fights. Whereas in the fight sequences that were seen, much like the one we're seeing right now, they basically were just cut together, and there's a flow of motion, arm swinging, leg swinging, and you never really get a sense of the same sense of power or the same sense of grace. And the thing is that James Tien, though he was not a terrific martial artist, certainly was capable of looking better than he does in The Big Boss. Because if you see him in Game of Death, and particularly in some of the unseen footage, some of the material shot for the Bruce Lee film Game of Death, where Bruce Lee was choreographing him, he looks good. I mean, he's throwing kicks and punches and using weapons in a very artistic way. So I think a lot of it is down to choreography. And a lot of the times people who you see in films who look very fast, very powerful, are in reality are not that great, but they've got a good director, a good choreographer, so they've been made to look fantastic. And there are other people who off-camera are really gifted, but maybe in a specific film don't look as good because the action director didn't know something as simple as where to put the camera, didn't know where the edit points are. So there's a lot more. I mean, there's the huge difference between real martial arts and movie martial arts. And sometimes I wonder if the audience is really aware of that how much of what they're seeing is the result of the magic of cinema. Death scene there for Abi, one of the veteran Hong Kong stuntmen. He's still on the scene. He was in this movie playing one of Bruce Lee's adopted brothers. And they did the old axe in the back trick, which was a popular ploy. I mean, these films really were. This film actually, by the standards of the day, is not that bloody. But if you look at some of the Shaw Brothers movies, they really did. And this stabbed in the stomach, the disemboweling, this kind of thing was very popular at the time in the Mandarin language cinema. And the Shaw Brothers films really painted the screen red with blood. Another issue that's come up over the years is the question of whether Bruce Lee was or was not a good actor. I've seen many reviews where people say, when Bruce Lee's not in action, he doesn't really understand acting. My feeling is that he was somebody with tremendous skills as a film actor, and he really understood how to play to the camera and to the audience. And he's somebody who had, I think, one element of screen acting, and it's different from big screen acting, that's different from any other kind of performance, is that very often you really have to convey emotion and feeling to the audience without doing too much, and you're a big image in close-up and or a major figure in the frame, and you have to communicate your feeling very directly. And Bruce Lee could do that effortlessly. The audience was never in any doubt in any scene in the film about how he was feeling about a circumstance or situation that he was in. Gentleman on the left there, closing the gate, is one of the great veterans of, sadly passed away a few years ago, Lam Ching-ying, who was a stuntman and made a name for himself later in life as an actor in his own right. He was the star of the popular Mr. Vampire movie series. And I got to interview him about a year before he passed away. He died of cancer just a few years ago. But I interviewed him, and he remembered working with Bruce Lee, and just the fact that before Bruce Lee flew out to Thailand, the stunt team was already there. And they were told that this new guy from the States had been signed, and he was getting this amount of money, and he was meant to be the next big star. And as I mentioned earlier, the stuntmen are a pretty rough, tough crew. So they were not sitting there going, oh, gee, here's somebody for us to idolize. They were like looking for somebody to put up or shut up. And Bruce Lee won their respect straight off the bat, not just because of his physical skills, but just because he didn't act like some of the stars of the day. He enjoyed the company of stuntmen. He enjoyed the company of supporting players. He never thought of himself as being above or below any of them, and this endeared him to everybody on the film set, from what I've been told of the people who were by the people who were physically there. And I think this has been one of the problems in terms of critical analysis or reporting on this era of Bruce Lee's life. I've seen so many books and magazine articles where Western writers have really covered very exhaustively Bruce Lee's life and focused on his years in America. Because obviously, from a Western point of view, those years are immediately accessible, because the people who knew Bruce at that time speak English. They're still easily accessible because they're living in Hollywood. Some of them are still famous, like James Coburn, for example. But the Hong Kong people that he worked with, the Chinese people, maybe are less accessible to Chinese writers. And Hong Kong is kind of a forbidden city to journalists from the West in some ways. They might not know where to find somebody who'd worked with Bruce Lee. So there's a lot of disinformation that's got out from over the years. So I've been lucky to have lived and worked in Hong Kong for the time of talking now, almost 7 years, and to have met and worked with some of the people who actually worked with Bruce Lee on The Big Boss, and to get first-hand from them. So, I mean, as much as I can on this commentary and any other writing that I might do about Bruce Lee, tried as much as possible to base it on the kind of the eyewitness reports of people who knew and worked with him. And now we get another one of the small scenes featuring Nora Miao, who would go on to become a very strong leading lady in Hong Kong film in her own right, and obviously was Bruce Lee's favorite leading lady because she co-starred with him. The zoom shot there. The directors of this era, they just love the zoom. It's like they discovered the zoom in like 1968, and they used the hell out of it ever since. But going back to what I was saying earlier, there's a lot of stories about Bruce Lee that are not borne out by the facts when you actually speak to people who were there and who knew him during that relatively narrow window of time after he moved back to Hong Kong to make this film, and when he unfortunately passed away in 1973. The gentleman on the right there is Tony Au, also known as Gold Tooth, and he's a veteran Hong Kong stuntman and martial arts actor. I had the pleasure of working with him on a TV version of the Bruce Lee film Fist of Fury. He played a kung fu master in that. I have to say, that it's one thing, to have died at your peak like Bruce Lee. Paul looks totally different now. You really would have a hard time. He's a little older, and you really wouldn't spot him in a police lineup as somebody from this movie. But I was introduced to him, and again got the opportunity to have dinner with him on the set and talk to him about memories of Bruce Lee and things happened on the movie. Of course, what people don't realize is that filmmaking is often a very boring activity. So there may not be huge numbers of stories of Bruce Lee fighting people off or demonstrating deadly technique. I mean, by all accounts, the shoot in Thailand was a very tough one. The equipment was primitive. The support facilities were very primitive. The place they were shooting was really off the beaten track. And so I think day by day the challenge was, how do we get these scenes shot? How do we shoot this film? And so that's what they were focused on, and no one was really thinking, hey, here we are working with a legend. It was only later when they look back on their life and think, wow, yeah, I got to make a movie with Bruce Lee. So there's not a huge number of stories, but those I've been told, uniformly, everybody says that Bruce Lee impressed both as an actor and as a martial artist. And you can see in The Big Boss that though there were talented people in the industry, and though there was a desire to make films, to make good films, the Hong Kong film industry really was way behind Hollywood and even Japan in terms of the basic techniques of filmmaking, because it really looks like a film from a bygone age. But this is just 1970, 1971. I mean, 1971, when the film was released, the other movies coming out with a French connection, Clockwork Orange, the Bond movie for that year was Diamonds Are Forever. The first Shaft film came out with Richard Roundtree. Sam Peckinpah, who was the other great innovator in terms of screen action, was making Straw Dogs. And you had two martial arts themed films coming out in the States, Billy Jack and Red Sun. But it's easy to see why this film set the world on fire. Well, it's easy to see in a moment. Here we see the warm-ups to the main event, and it's in terms of the structure, it's very smart the way that Bruce is kind of restrained for the first part of the film. He doesn't just come out at the beginning as a martial arts Superman, but we see that he's made a promise that he mustn't fight. And of course, the audience has a sense, we gave them a taste earlier in the film, that this guy actually does know a thing or two, but he hasn't gone into action yet. So there's a palpable sense here where we see the relatives and the people that he's living with, his newfound family, are forced to go into action, and he's having to stand by, and the audience is waiting and waiting for him to go into action. And I think this is a very Chinese sensibility, the idea of somebody who is genuinely a martial arts master, but only goes into action at the last resort when it's for a good cause, in this case family and the country, because I think as well as being somebody fighting on behalf of his newfound relatives, Bruce Lee is also seen in this movie as somebody upholding the honor of the Chinese people against the bullying Thai overlords. And then later in the film, he's fighting the big boss, who is, though he's Chinese, is somebody who's basically using his position in a foreign country to oppress his own people. And this movie, this sequence, I think Bruce did have some input on, because you can see there's an imaginative way that every element of the ice house is being used for the fight sequence. And the movements themselves are more clear and distinct. It's not quite that same swinging arm style that was prevalent in Hong Kong film at that time. And the edit points are clearer. So you actually see some, the cuts are used to enhance the impact of the techniques that you're seeing. And none of these guys, none of the Thais were professional stuntmen, and often you can see them in the background standing there, which is one of the problems that you always have with unprofessional stuntmen, is that they stand there waiting to get hit or go into action. Now we see Bruce Lee could actually take a punch as well as give one, and the tension almost palpable as the reinforcements arrive, and it's obvious to everybody that Bruce Lee is going to enter the fray. And I think, as I said earlier, it's impossible for anybody now to realize quite the impact this had when they saw this new style of action and this new kind of Chinese hero. Given the kind of films that were prevalent at that time, the stylized swordplay movies, the really hokey hand-to-hand, more hokey hand-to-hand combat films with people performing really outrageous feats. There's some outrageous stuff in this film, but the stuff that impresses is when you see Bruce Lee doing on film what everybody knows he could do in reality. And here he is absolutely setting the screen on fire with his first action scene and this continuity of movement. And what's even more impressive is the fact that in choreographing the scenes, he could actually position these stuntmen who were not professionals to be in the right place at the right time to get kicked and punched by him, supposedly kicked and punched by him, and not seriously injured. And that's on the right there, Peter Chan, actually not a Thai. He was a Chinese stuntman, Chan Long. He's the one professional Chinese stuntman among the Thais. And because he's kind of swarthy looking, he fit the bill. So he was convincing as a Thai heavy, and took a good kick from Bruce. And just that quick exhalation of air and the look, those small touches. I mean, now it looks so obvious, but at the time, just the care and the detail with which Bruce Lee painted these fight scenes. I mean, it was really like he was putting the fight together with brushstrokes, whereas everybody else was using a spray can or color by numbers, and POV shots, fast combination of movement, and actually very distracting. You can see that bandage on his right hand is very evident, where I talked about earlier when he cut his hand with a glass. This is shortly after the injury happened. And this one of the key sequences, not just in Hong Kong action cinema, but in world action cinema, when a whole new aesthetic was introduced, and Bruce Lee had fought long and hard in Hollywood to find a vehicle where he could really show the international audience what he could do in front of and behind the camera. And for its own reasons, Hollywood at that time was not receptive, so he really had to go back to Hong Kong to make his mark. And one of the producers he'd worked with in Hollywood was Fred Weintraub, and they'd been developing The Warrior, which would later become the TV series Kung Fu. And Fred had, tried but failed to get studios interested in working with Bruce, but had said to Bruce Lee when he knew that Bruce was going back to Hong Kong or back to Asia, please keep me informed on what you're doing, and maybe we can still do something. So Bruce sent a print of The Big Boss when the film was finished. This is, of course, before the days of video, so he actually sent a 35mm print back to Fred, and they screened the movie, and there was suddenly some interest. Gee, this guy really may have something after all. This being the same man who, after The Green Hornet and a few little parts in Marlowe and elsewhere, had really been turned down as a leading man by most of the studios in Hollywood. When they saw what he could do in The Big Boss and later in Fist of Fury, suddenly there was a sense of that this was an international star in the making, and that led Fred to be able to raise the financing from Warner Brothers to make Enter the Dragon, which remains probably the archetypal martial arts picture, the most famous and influential martial arts picture of all time. And The Big Boss itself is quite influential because it was remade a few years later by Golden Harvest, and it was called at that time The Skyhawk, and starred Quan Tak Hing. And Quan Tak Hing had been the first great martial arts action hero. If Bruce Lee was the second, then Quan Tak Hing was the first. He played the Cantonese martial arts master Wong Fei Hung in a long series of black and white films. And Golden Harvest had the idea of actually bringing him back and having him reviving his career in the early 70s, seeing as kung fu films were suddenly popular again. And so they cast him in this film, The Skyhawk, which was shot in Thailand by a very talented Korean director called Cheng Chang-ho. And Cheng Chang-ho had actually filmed King Boxer, a.k.a. Five Fingers of Death, which was a Shaw Brothers movie starring an actor called Law Leet. And that was actually the first martial arts picture really to work in the overseas market, and primarily in the American domestic market. And he was a very gifted director. He made a number of other interesting films, and it's a shame that he and Bruce Lee never worked together. I think if he directed The Big Boss, it would have been a more consistent film overall than the film that Lo Wei directed, because Cheng Chang-ho was very talented. Unfortunately, he made only a few films in Hong Kong before he returned to make films in Korea. And when you look at Skyhawk, it's interesting to see how much of the background is Thailand. You look at the film, yes, this film is shot in Thailand. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, with The Big Boss, it's fairly generic, and there's nothing really, apart from the fact, I guess it was cheaper to shoot there, and the plot point was that you had Bruce as a hero coming to Thailand to the rescue of his relatives. And there's been talk over the years about scenes cut from Big Boss. There's obviously, if you look at an early trailer, which I believe is featured elsewhere on this DVD, you can see there's one scene on the balcony of the house, the same house that we're looking at now, where James Tien reenacts this fight, I guess the fight he had with the heavies from the casino. And he grabs Lee Kun at the groin, and Bruce and the others are looking on. And I guess this was filmed maybe by Ga-seung as for the original director of the film, shooting sequences for the original version of the film, and it was then cut out. And another scene that people always talk about is a scene from a fight later in the movie where Bruce Lee sinks a saw into the head of an opponent. And this scene definitely was shot, and it was in the early prints of the movie, and then it was cut out by the censors. Apparently there was a move afoot at that time to censor some of the violence in local films. and that scene was that shot or that scene was cut out. And people have always asked me over the years, Bruce Lee fans, well, why wasn't this material saved? Why didn't anybody keep a copy of the complete film? And you really have to understand that for most of the history of Hong Kong film, and even perhaps to this day, Hong Kong cinema was regarded as a disposable commodity. You shot a film, you played it in the theaters in Hong Kong, you played it in any other market you could to recoup your investment and make a profit. And after that, you basically forgot about it. And the whole idea of films and film libraries having a long shelf life beyond their initial theatrical release is a relatively recent phenomenon. And at the time The Big Boss was made, you didn't really have... You had maybe limited re-release potential. There's no video, there's no... we don't have our wonderful DVDs like we have today. Even television, this kind of film, it's unlikely that you get a big TV deal with it. So really, you made the film, you put it in cold storage, and you moved on. And there was not a sense of preserving a piece of history. I mean, the other thing is that nobody knew that Bruce Lee tragically was going to pass away just a few years after this film was made. Had they known that, then yes, they might have swept the cutting room floor and kept all the outtakes and the rehearsal footage and everything. But nobody knew that. And it was really, at the time, just another film that turned out to be a masterpiece or turned out to be a groundbreaking martial arts picture. But when the film was being made, when it was being edited, when it was being prepared for release, I don't think anybody held the film in their hands and thought, okay, I'm working on a classic. It was just work. And unfortunately, we can't go back in time and save all those lost pieces of footage. And the other scene that people talk about is at the end of the movie, when Bruce Lee seems to go back to the whorehouse that he's been visiting earlier in the film, and seems to be about to engage in a very primitive human need with another hooker. And very strange for the character, very strange for Bruce Lee to be doing this in a film. And all I can think of is that this was something that Lo Wei had specialized in, that he was famous for having very frank approach towards romance and sexuality in his films. And I think that, as Bruce Lee explained in an interview with Ted Thomas, that his rationale when he was asked to shoot this scene, which was later cut, was that his character was a very basic, primitive kind of person and was going out maybe to die, and he thought, well, hell, I'm going to experience life before I die. So you see him going, after he's made the decision, going to visit the prostitute, and whatever happens, happens. And then even on the way to the final showdown, he's crunching on these prawn crackers, maybe they're his favorite food. He really wants to taste life before he will possibly be killed. So that was his rationale behind it. And Bruce Lee's character in this film, I mean, it's not a very sophisticated character, it's not a very sophisticated performance, but at least there is an arc to it of this innocent, this guy coming from obviously a very simple background into this really quite complicated environment, and getting tricked by the cunning local, the Thai foreman here, and by, of course, the Han Ying-chieh character, the big boss, who really run rings around him in terms of their sophistication, and at the end realizes he's been duped and really makes the decision to redeem himself by laying down his life in an effort to get revenge for his murdered relatives. And here's the first scene featuring Malaline, who's was a local Thai actress. And I think one reason she was cast as opposed to a Chinese girl, a Chinese actress being cast, is that the film required rather tame nudity by current standards. But in Hong Kong at that time, there was a very clear line between actresses who were, perceived as being ladies, and those who would have romantic scenes of any kind, and those who would do, the equivalent of a softcore sexy films, and those lines were not crossed. So if you wanted somebody for this kind of movie, obviously they felt this actress was prepared to perform in a way that maybe an actress from Hong Kong would not. And nice product placement for Hennessy there. I don't know if their sales went up or down after this film came out. The the soundtrack to the movie was composed by two veterans of the industry, Joseph Koo and James Wong. Joseph Koo, of course, probably the single most influential soundtrack composer to come out of Hong Kong during the 70s and 80s, who also composed the score for several of the John Woo films, including A Better Tomorrow. And the end titles of the Japanese version of the film feature a song entitled To Be a Man, which was the music was written by Joseph Koo and the lyrics by James Wong. And it's performed by a local star of the era called Mike Remedios. And I had the pleasure of meeting Mike not so long ago. I'd seen his name on the sleeves of the Japanese import albums, but I didn't know anything about him, and he's a charming fellow. He lives now in Canada, semi-retired, still has a very good voice, and the circumstances under which I met him, there were some Japanese investors and music producers wanting to do an album of Bruce Lee songs, and they sought him out and brought him back to Hong Kong to record these songs again, and it was really extraordinary. And also involved with the project was Anders Nelson, a local former pop star turned music impresario turned actor, who was also in a Bruce Lee movie. He was in Way of the Dragon. So it's an ongoing and extraordinary journey, this whole experience of the Bruce Lee phenomenon. And the score has been changed over the years. When it was re-released in 1981 in the Cantonese version, there was a new score dubbed in, which was composed by a gentleman called Wang Fuling, which borrows liberally from a track called Time, which was recorded by Pink Floyd. So let's go back and talk a bit more about how Bruce came to be discovered and why the way he was reintroduced to the Hong Kong market. As I was talking about earlier, there were several people who knew of Bruce Lee as somebody who'd been a movie star in Hong Kong, had moved to the States, become involved with martial arts, had been in a few American productions where he'd shown his martial arts skills. But so there's a difference between being aware of somebody and actually putting up money to bring them back to Hong Kong to star in films. And I think the thing about Hong Kong, the industry, is that your relative worth is set by whatever someone else is willing to pay. So nobody actually wants to be the first guy to put money on the table. When somebody else does, everybody's like, hell, if he thinks this person, this commodity is worth this amount of money, maybe there's something in it. And of course, the first gentleman to put money up to sign Bruce Lee to star in Mandarin films was Raymond Chow of Golden Harvest. And Bruce was, I believe, paid the princely sum of US $7,500 per film for The Big Boss and later for Fist of Fury, which were the first two films under his initial contract with Golden Harvest. And the contract, when it was signed, was actually not signed in Thailand or at the Golden Harvest studios up on Hammer Hill Road, but actually in the Tung Ying building, which still stands on Nathan Road. Ironically, the famous Golden Harvest studio, is no more. It was demolished a couple of years ago when the land was repossessed by the government. But the Tung Ying building, it still stands. I mean, there's another, I think there's a shipping company in the office where the Golden Harvest offices used to be. But that's actually where the historic deal was signed. And that was the deal that brought Bruce back to Hong Kong. And, of course, as soon as there was word got out that Raymond had secured Bruce Lee's services, other producers felt that maybe they would like to examine the possibility of working with him as well, primarily Run Run Shaw of Shaw Brothers. And so Raymond Chow was so worried about being his new star being poached that he had him fly. He wanted Bruce Lee to fly directly to Bangkok and not to come via Hong Kong. But Bruce Lee, I think, is somebody, as much as you pulled, he'd push, and if you pushed, he'd pull. So he was somebody who, he said, no, I want to go to Hong Kong, if only just for a quick stopover, en route to Bangkok, and just to prove that there was nobody who could really tell Bruce Lee what to do. And this scene, by today's standards, is really very tame, but for 1971 Hong Kong was really quite raunchy. And I mean, this was, I think, one of the selling points of the film, is that there was this amazing new star in Bruce Lee, and then a sense of, if you go and see this film, you'll see a new kind of action and a new maturity to Hong Kong filmmaking, if I can call it that, at least a kind of a realism, because again, it's all relative to the other films being made at the time. But the prevalent genre, the swordplay films at that time, everybody was so well-mannered. They were all dressed the same in these elegant Chinese robes. Everything was set back in the old dynasties of China, with everybody reciting poetry and really very idealistic heroes. And The Big Boss is part of, I guess, a neo-realistic resurgence in Hong Kong film, when the characters, though they might not be any more or less real people than anybody else you see in an action film, at least their motivations and their emotions are realistic. Whereas the swordplay films which were and are and still enjoy a following in Asia, were one step removed from reality. And this, I'm sorry to say, is a real Thai chicken coop, a real Thai brothel, where they were filming, and they actually paid the girls more not to work than they got paid when they did work. And so I guess that's some small consolation, but that's actually a real operating whorehouse and not a set. A little light moment here as Bruce Lee does the Keystone Cops run, having been found to have spent the night in the brothel. And shame on him. And now you see the conflict developing between him and his adopted family, as he's really been duped by the Thais and by Han Yan-git, Han Yan-git's henchmen. So he doesn't really know how to handle the situation, and pressure is mounting on him to actually take action, and he delays and delays until it's too late. And again, for an international film, a European film, this really would not be any great breakthrough in terms of character definition. But for Hong Kong films, where of the era, where the characters were pretty cut and dried, even this degree of psychological depth was really something. And again, I think it goes towards the fact that The Big Boss, apart from being the first Bruce Lee film, apart from introducing a new kind of martial arts fight scene, also had a return to a kind of realism that had been missing from the cinema, and characters with these realistic foibles and failings and motivations. And the set you see behind them there, the Ice House set, proved challenging in an unexpected way for Bruce, because as the Bruce Lee fans will know, and those of you who are not Bruce Lee fans, I mean, Bruce Lee was somebody who had overcome the imperfections of the human body. One of the ailments he had to contend with was the fact that he was really very short-sighted, and so he was forced to wear. When he was younger, he wore thick glasses, and then as he grew older, he wore contact lenses. And actually, during one of the action sequences in the film, his contact lens fell out, and they had to find it on the floor of the ice house. Obviously, with all the shards of ice and all the other stuff you find on the floor of a movie set or a place where a film's being shot, it was quite a challenge to find the lens. But they did that, and of course, Bruce had a lot of. He wasn't somebody who was born a perfect physical specimen. He was somebody who created himself through long years of training and devotion to developing himself physically and mentally. But when he was born, he had one leg shorter than the other, an undescended testicle, very, very poor eyesight. I remember his student down in Santo saying to me, really, he couldn't see worth a darn. And despite that, went on to become this, awesome film superhero, a genuine film legend. And here we see Cheng Chao-an visiting the Big Boss at this palatial lair. And I can reveal exclusively, I think, that the actual use of this building it was a mausoleum. It's a place where wealthy Thai or Thai or Chinese people, when they passed away, their ashes were stored in the big building that we see supposedly as the boss's lair. And that's the actual use to which the building was put, and they just rented it to the production. And Chinese people are very superstitious. They would not normally film at a place that was used for this kind of business. So they didn't find out until after they shot the film that that's actually what the place was used for. This is what I'm told. I wasn't there on the set, so I can't say. There you see some trampoline shots as Bruce Lee's avoiding these vicious attack dogs. And there was a documentary about Bruce that came out last year, and they actually interviewed the guy that trained the dogs. That's how dedicated people have become in terms of finding information out about Bruce Lee. So they actually interviewed the dog trainer. And it really is a magnificent setting for the film. And I think if there's no other good reason to go to Thailand to film, it would be that you could shoot a location like this, because certainly there was nowhere in Hong Kong with a garden like that and a building where you could actually in one take bring the characters in from the grass and all the way through this, by Hong Kong standards, palatial apartment, but a palatial building. You couldn't have done that in Hong Kong. So now the first real encounter between the hero and the villain, and it kind of follows the formula of the James Bond films, because in the Bond movies there's normally a very civilized encounter between 007 and the criminal mastermind before they actually go into action against each other in the final reel. And so in that respect, it's an example of a Hong Kong film following one of the conventions laid down by Hollywood action cinema. And in a moment, we see a rare use of a gimmick in a Bruce Lee movie. And again, maybe it's a James Bond style thing, this sadistic dart in a pipe, which we don't see in any of the other Bruce Lee movies, and it's like a unique bit of sadism. But Law Wei's other films have lots of devices like this, so I think it's something that Law Wei brought into the film. And you see the reaction of Bruce again. The sense of, he knows what this guy's all about, and communicating with the camera, with the audience. And this is really the essence of screen acting, which is why I get frustrated when people try to tell me that Bruce Lee was a poor actor, was not a good actor. I mean, to me, he never really got to develop as a screen actor, as a leading man in Hollywood movies, in international films, when we might have seen different aspects of his persona reflected on screen. But certainly in regard within the kind of the limitations of Hong Kong film, where the films really had to play to a largely uneducated and unsophisticated audience, his performance works very well. And even now, he's obviously effortlessly leagues ahead of the other people he was working with, both as an actor and as an on-screen action performer. And amazing, really, the way he holds the camera, even in scenes where he's not in action. And I've always said that one of the differences between Bruce Lee and most of the martial arts movie stars that have come along since is that with many of the other martial arts heroes, unless they're jumping around kicking people, we're not really interested in them. We're not that concerned about them. They really have to be in motion to be interesting. With Bruce, you could have had 50 people in the room kicking and punching, and Bruce Lee just standing there in the background. And he would be more interesting. He would be where your eye was focused. And he proved it. I mean, there's several scenes in his films where he's the still point in a very active frame. And I think that's evidence of the sheer screen presence that he had. So let's talk a little bit about Lau Wing, who you see at the left of frame there in the pink shirt, who's playing the son of the big boss. And this was his first movie, and he's very accomplished in the movie, I think. He had a very relaxed screen presence. He's one of the guys where I think if there maybe hadn't been a Bruce Lee, he would have been a bigger star. But there was several people who came up around about the same time as Bruce and were really unfairly compared with him as martial arts fighters or as actors, and didn't do as well as they might otherwise have done. And he actually starred in a movie, The Manchu Boxer, which was an early Golden Harvest martial arts picture. It didn't do very well, and after that he was relegated to B-movies and later to TV. He's actually in great shape today. Of all of the people who were contemporary of Bruce Lee, he looks the best today, and really found his métier as a TV actor. I mean, he was very good at acting on TV. Quick encounter here between Bruce and Lee Kun. And Lee Kun still alive and well and living in Taiwan, and he was a prolific actor in this era, and always playing pretty much the same role this kind of sarcastic, bumbling simpleton. We see him play the same kind of part in Fist of Fury. And that was Hong Kong film for that time. I mean, if you were a leading player, you played the same role in film after film. And if you were a character player, you played the same part in film after film. And I guess it's the same in Hollywood, but in Hong Kong it seemed to be you were even more rigidly stereotyped. And as I was talking about earlier, he had a hit later in his career with Shantung Man in Hong Kong. And interesting, Shantung to be mentioned again because it's the province that gave us Jackie Chan and also Han Yan-git. And in the film, Shantung Man in Hong Kong, which is kind of one of those movies that's been lost to history. I got to watch it a year or so ago. It's a comedy take on, it's kind of even more outrageous comedy in the same structure as a Bruce Lee film, with Logan as obviously not a martial arts expert, but he's a guy who comes to Hong Kong from a backwards town in China, and it's all about his misadventures. And Lee Kun also appeared in the one film that Bruce Lee's younger brother, Robert, made at Golden Harvest, which was called The Romantic Star. And he's in there very briefly, as are actually many of the actors who worked with Bruce Lee. It was an attempt, unfortunately not a successful one, to launch Robert Lee as a star in his own right. And we see the feeling that Maria Yi's character is beginning to feel for Cheng Chao-an. Quick shot here of the three guys. Tony Au in the middle there, still active in the Hong Kong TV industry, and on the right of the frame there, Lam Ching-ying, sadly no longer with us. And the romantic interlude between the two of them. And she really perfectly cast Maria Yi, because there's a certain look that producers at that time were looking for the naive young Chinese girl. And it was ponytails and a very sweet expression. And she was never a great actress. I mean, I feel maybe she was somebody who came into the industry for the same reason a lot of young women did during this era, which was that you became famous, you became high profile, and then you could actually find a nice husband and marry somebody wealthy and retire and live a very comfortable life. And that's, I think, really why she maybe got in the business, and why, after only very few films, she left to enjoy domestic bliss and hasn't been heard from since. That's one thing about Hong Kong as opposed to Hollywood. In Hong Kong, when people retire, that's it. You don't see them on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. They just vanish from the scene. Again, evidence that Lo Wei actually is much better at night, shoots better at night than day. These moody shots here as Bruce Lee returns to the whorehouse, and he's actually going to do some detective work and find out what he can about the big boss. And Marla Lane coming up here. And as I was saying earlier, all these ladies in the background, they're not extras. They are actually women of the night who were being paid to sit there and provide background colour for this sequence. And we're coming up to one of the other some of the gratuitous nudity seen in this film. Again, something that Lo Wei brought in, but it was something I think that the audiences wanted. They'd had, as I say, years and years of these very refined swordplay action films, and they wanted something different, I think, at the beginning of the 70s. And that's another thing that I think I've read stories about aspects of Bruce Lee's life, and I think people have to remember he was a child of the 60s, in that he'd been in America during the swinging 60s, and not just in America, but he was in Los Angeles and hanging out with James Coburn and Steve McQueen and all these other icons of the age of Aquarius. And why wouldn't he be a product of that more than of the Shaolin Temple or traditional Hong Kong lifestyle? I mean, that's the life he'd been living, the experience he'd been having. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, we look back on his life and from the position of being in the new millennium. And the fact of the matter is that this was 1971, and 1970 when the film was made, and a very different world to the one we're in now. And now some misdirection by Lo Wei, and a textbook example of how you can actually break the grammar of camera language. As you see, Lo Wei comes in from the right, the girl's looking off to the left, the knife comes from the left to the right, so it makes no sense. And the audience probably don't analyze the shots, but they feel there's something wrong. I mean, then that shot always got a laugh. Every time I saw the movie in England, I saw this film a bunch of times in theatres. People always used to laugh at that scene because they could feel the wrongness of the way it was cut together. And I have to say, that was probably down to Logan and not down to Bruce Lee. Now we have the most atmospheric sequence in the film, as Ying-chieh has realized that there must be something going on more than meets the eye behind the disappearance of his relatives and the way this town is under the thumb of this Chinese crime boss. And so he's going back to see what it is exactly that's packed in the ice. And boy, is he going to get a surprise. But the whole sequence is very well set up. And it's really the lighting, the lighting. The characters are lit from beneath. Bruce Lee is lit from beneath, and really the audience goes on this journey with him. And the use of red there to enhance a sense of mystery and danger. And there is, I think, in the film, under the surface, a sense of real violence that's very different from the martial arts, the balletic martial arts violence that Bruce Lee was doing. And I think it was set up earlier in the scene when the very first two relatives are killed very, very abruptly and taken to be carved up. And then it has its payoff later in this whole sequence. There really is a smack of real violence. Because people always ask me about violence in films, and I say there is no violence in films because it's not real, it's action, it's movie action. But sometimes I think there can be a sequence that really has about it a sense of real violence, and this does. And another convention of cinema is why so many people immediately know the taste or smell of drugs when they come across a packet of white powder. I mean, I have no idea, I'm happy to say, what opium or cocaine or heroin tastes like. But every time you see a movie where somebody finds drugs, they always have a taste of it, and they know, aha, it's heroin. And there's the remains of the woman that Bruce was just questioning. And they certainly got her chopped up and in the ice very, very fast. There's remains of James Tien. And some cuts of the film, actually, you see more of the bodies in the ice, bits of the body parts in the ice. And this next scene really raised the bar in terms of on-screen action, because it's not that the technique is necessarily so groundbreaking, but the way that he uses everything at hand to survive. And there's a realism there. And, of course, this goes back to the underlying philosophy of Bruce was that you needed reality, that if you were in this kind of situation, it would be no good to, assume the crane position. You really had to use technique, any technique that would work, and any implement at hand to survive. And that's just what he's doing. And it was amazing. We'll come back now to the most famous missing shot in the canon of the Bruce Lee films. And as you see, he's surrounded. It's the pacing of the film, of this fight, is what makes it work. Because, of course, if they all charged in at once, he'd have a rough time of it. And goes for the saw, picks it up, bang, should go down to the guy's head. And that frame has never been seen. That scene has been cut. And all we've got of it is actually still frames. And Bruce, again, with the challenge of realistically fighting this kind of number. And just the way the camera's placed so that you have a sense of spectacle, a sense of drama. He really takes, every last ounce of energy he can from the scene. And if you just compare that to the sequence earlier when James Tien was fighting multiple opponents, there's just no comparison. And still a few, Logan insisting on a few of the gimmicks of the genre being included. The wireless, the trampoline jumps. I mean, there's really no need for it because the audience is impressed enough, surely, with what Bruce Lee physically can do. And you see the application of techniques that would really work, interspersed with stuff that's really just for cinema. And that, of course, is Bruce's strength. He knew exactly when to play to the crowd and when he knew exactly when to deliver something. Another the reverse action there. Bruce Lee actually moved his head away from the knife, and then they run the film backwards. Probably the least appreciated shot. I don't mind it myself. I think it's kind of hokey, but it's kind of fun. The outline of the guy on the wall. And now Bruce versus Lao Wing. And Bruce, constantly had this theme in films of being cut and then tasting the blood. And one of his students, Larry Hartzell, told me that he'd actually introduced this practice, this odd practice to Bruce, that he'd been in a bar fight and been cut and had managed to freak out his opponent by tasting his blood. And Bruce had been impressed by this story, and so he introduced it into his own fight sequences. And indeed, when Bruce does it, it takes on a whole new resonance. I mean, he was a master of gesture, no doubt about it. And this sequence here really is not about technique. It's just about this sheer power, the sheer energy of Bruce Lee finally unleashed after all these years of frustration. And this fist of fury. And it was just so amazing. It really was the fist that rocked the world. You look at this and you just think other screen fighters just don't have anything close. And there's nothing sophisticated. It's just this pure conduit of energy. And I can well remember the first time I saw the fight sequence. I can't put myself in the mind of the people in Hong Kong. They must have just been stunned to see one of their own manifest this kind of energy on the screen. And as I was mentioning earlier, Lo Wei, as a director, was very good at setting up gothic scenes, dark scenes, scenes when grim things happen. And really in this sequence, which is a wordless sequence, where Bruce Lee is just communicating with the camera, we really get to see Bruce Lee, the actor, as he's really coming to terms with what's just happened and, what will be the consequences of the fact that he's just killed somebody. I mean, this isn't a man who goes around killing for a living. This is probably the first time he's ever killed somebody, which is why he should have this kind of reaction of being just shocked and stunned. And Bruce communicates that perfectly. And now they're setting up the horror with that, unfortunately, rather odd-coloured blood that Mandarin films used to use. But his reaction to it, I mean, it's interesting that there's an echo of this scene in Fist of Fury, because in the movie Fist of Fury, Bruce Lee also comes back to his adopted home and finds that people have been slaughtered. And another cut there from the body under I think in the first print of the movie, there was a more graphic image of the body under the mosquito net. And this is really a great acting job by Bruce Lee, because these characters have never been really that defined in the film. The relatives, the people he's living with, they're just... He meets them, and then immediately there's this conflict over the fact that he's been duped by the boss. So the sense of loss that we have here, the audience doesn't really feel a sense of loss because we've never been that close to the characters. What's important is that Bruce Lee's character feels the loss and communicates it. And it goes back to what I was saying about the fact that Bruce Lee was a great screen actor. And he learned a lot of this. I mean, people forget he was an experienced actor, a screen actor, before he left Hong Kong originally to return to the States. And so he had a good basic training, and coupled this with the fact that when he was in Hollywood, he was watching very experienced movie actors working on the films he worked at in Hollywood. So that he came back with this unique East-West perspective. And from the very first film, you see this in the performance, in the acting technique, which is sometimes, as in this sequence, quite subdued, and sometimes, as in the action sequences, very extravagant. This balance between East and West, and I think this would have developed further and further had Bruce Lee lived to make more films. And a touching moment here between Bruce and Lei Kun, who of course is the character that he's had the most conflict with, so the character with whom he now comes to terms after the man has been killed. And if you look at other films of the period, I mean, there's really a rush to vengeance. Somebody's killed, the master is offended, and immediately the protagonist goes into battle. And in this film, you really have this interesting break between the discovery of the crime and vengeance. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about Bruce Lee, this film following some themes of filial piety, of Chinese traditional thought. Here, Bruce Lee's character is thinking about his mother back in Hong Kong, what will happen to her if he's killed in the final showdown. And this, to Western audiences, perhaps they're thinking, well, come on, these people have been wiped out, go and take your revenge, you're the hero. But the Chinese audience would really, it would give Bruce Lee's character, Cheng Chao-an, a greater depth and give them greater respect for him, that instead of blindly leaping into battle, he thinks about his family responsibilities first, which is, Confucian ideal, first the family, then the nation. So in this sense, Bruce Lee's thinking about his family, which is his mother, and then, of course, thinking about the nation, which is what he has to do as a Chinese to avenge the death of his countrymen. And this symbolic gesture as he takes he's actually packed up his clothes because he's can't quite decide whether to take revenge or to leave, to go back from this cursed country. And so he's made his decision, there's no turning back. And a little scene that's in some prints of the movie sees him running now to a stall to buy the prawn crackers we see him eating in this sequence. And you get a quick shot coming up of him going over the fence, this trampoline technique. That's actually the stuntman Ying-chieh. And Ying-chieh is actually executing a number of stunts elsewhere in the film. Basically, any flying technique where you can't see the face of the person in flight. It's Ying-chieh, who was a kung fu classmate, a Chinese opera school classmate of Jackie Chan, and made a name for himself as one of the most acrobatic of the Hong Kong stuntmen. And now the Thai henchman coming out to face Bruce. And I guess this is the equivalent of the cheroot for the man with no name, the prawn crackers. As I was saying earlier, maybe they're his favourite food and he wants to die with their taste in his mouth. And the sequence coming up, it's interesting, one of the areas of influence of Bruce Lee that's kind of underappreciated is Japanese cinema. Because it's known that when he was in the States, he used to go and see the Chanbara films, go and see the swordplay movies of Akira Kurosawa and the other Japanese directors. And technically, the films were way ahead of the kind of movies that were being made in Hong Kong. And Bruce Lee was very impressed by that. And he, in fact, worked with a Japanese cinematographer on Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon and Game of Death, and really wanted to adopt the sophisticated technique of Japanese action cinematography. It's interesting now, of course, Hong Kong film is perceived as being way ahead of Japanese cinema in terms of action sequences. But the way this knife fight is cut together is very much the style of Chanbara. I mean, the sword movements, even though he's not using the long sword, the way he's holding the two knives, it's the Miyamoto Musashi style of quick motions followed by a pose of this kind of dancing blades of fury. This sequence actually was cut for UK and some other markets, so there was always a mystery about how he managed to actually demolish all of the Thai henchmen. This shot here where he's throwing the knife over his shoulder, that was cut. Not much rhyme and reason to some of the cuts imposed on the Bruce Lee films. Now another little bit of the Lo Wei style of hokery, as the big boss there, as many Chinese men do, he's keeping a pet bird in a cage, and Bruce's act of defiance, he smashes the cage, and then that's going to be it. Battle going to be joined. And really this is a battle not just between two men, but between the old guard and the new, with Han Yan-git, I think, representing the old guard of Hong Kong film fight choreographers or Hong Kong kung fu movie performers, and Bruce Lee the new guard, because after Bruce Lee came on the scene, Hong Kong films were never going to be the same again. There'd be a new level of authenticity required. And Han Yang-git, of course, was a bona fide martial arts expert, but it was the films that were really unrealistic prior to Bruce Lee's arrival. So you have a sequence here where Bruce is going to use his scientific street fighting against the different techniques employed by Han Yang-git. And Han Yang-git, I mean, I think, considering the age difference between them and the level of fitness and speed and strength, really acquits himself well. And you need a good villain. I mean, it's something that really can't be underestimated. If for Bruce Lee to look great, he has to kick somebody who looks like a worthy foe. And when he kicks the person, that person has to react, because if the guy just stands there, then Bruce Lee will not look powerful. And, of course, at the same time, the sequence should be executed in such a way that no one really gets hurt, but the appearance is that you have two men in the middle of combat. And it's fascinating to me the way that another area that Bruce Lee was inspired was the Western movies. If you look at the John Wayne movies, when the guy punches, he pulls his fist back from way back in Chicago somewhere. And that's something you see in Bruce's films, and it's quite different to his style of combat, of trapping and close-range punching, but it works for the cinema. And this fight sequence is interesting because even though by the standards of the fights Bruce was going to do afterwards, it's rather primitive, there's elements here that he would develop later. The use of perspective shots where he's kicking directly into the camera, and the idea of ranges of combat, cinematically expressing his theory about the different ranges of combat. And they work through from the weapons range, as we're moving into weapons range now, as Han Yang-git, unable to get the better of Bruce in hand-to-hand combat, goes for a knife. We'll have kicking range, grappling range. Each range of combat is expressed in the fight sequence. And again, I look at this and I just think, why would Law Wei think we were that interested in seeing this girl run to rescue Nora Mao's character? At this point, the audience really just want to see the fight sequence. And evidence, I think, of the fact that Law Wei, though a very successful director in his time, his style of filmmaking has dated, and it goes back to what has once been said, that fashion dates and style doesn't. And Bruce Lee had style, and certainly has never dated. And during the shooting of this finale, Bruce actually pulled a muscle in his leg. So you had to find a reason why he was not as mobile in the latter part of the fight as in the earlier part. So there's a shot coming up where Han Yang-git actually has to stab Bruce in the leg because he was injured at this point. You needed a reason why he slows down just for the finale. And there's the shot there, diving. Bruce goes in, and you notice that they don't let Bruce walk between shots now because his foot was injured. So it's just quick movements, and you never actually see him walk. Interesting here, the leg trapping, grappling, rolling on the ground. Again, because, as I mentioned, Bruce had pulled a muscle at this point, so they were he was trying to find a way to conceal this as far as the camera was concerned. And a lot of this is sold by the facial expressions, and you really get an impression in these scenes that they're trying to stick the knife in. And the sense of realism, you really have to see it. You have to watch some of the other Hong Kong movies shot the same year to really know what it was about this kind of sequence the audience appreciated. And this another sequence that's cut in the American print. They cut this sequence so that you didn't really see this deadly finger thrust that finishes off Han Yang-git. And then Bruce jumping on top, and then when they cut to the close-up of him, you see the skies darken, so you get unfortunately, I guess they're running out of time, so even though the continuity wasn't there, they had to shoot this scene. And the police coming in, and I mean, I've read interviews where people have said, that Bruce insisted that his character pay for his crimes. In fact, this was par for the course. In some of the markets where the film was distributed, anybody who killed somebody or who broke the law would have to be arrested or die at the end. So you always had these kind of tagged-on endings where the police hauled guys off the jail. There's even one ending of Game of Death where the Bruce Lee character is arrested and taken away for having killed people. So here we are at the end of Big Boss. I've really enjoyed watching it again. I hope my comments maybe shed some light on some areas of the film that you were not aware of, maybe even if you saw the film 24 times, the way I have. It's been great to look at the movie and to share some ideas with you. This is Logan signing off. Thank you, and see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.